Okay, I'm going to get started. Hi, I'm Lori Wolf. I'm with the NSRWA and the Water Smart program. And Gardening Green Expo is sponsored by NSRWA, the Water Smart program, and Kennedy's Country Gardens. Before I get started, I just want to go over a few things. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, just type them in the chat and I will read them at the end. Now I would like to introduce Evan Abramson, founder and principal of Landscape Interactions with Habitat to Habitat, transforming landscapes into resilient ecosystems from concept to maintenance.
Hi, everyone. My name's Evan. I'm the principal of Landscape Interactions. And yeah, I live in Western Massachusetts, where I've been for the past 8 years and working across the state, across New England, and across the Northeast. Um, Tonight, I'll be presenting to you all um, a couple of different projects that we've done. At different scales, transforming landscapes into resilient native ecosystems. And before we go into that, I'll give you a little bit of background and a look at some of the scientific research that informs our design and planning work. So we're living in a unique time in the history of the Earth. The Earth has been transformed by humans, and we're living in a geological epoch, which is called the age of the Anthropocene. And the age of the Anthropocene is defined by things like rising carbon dioxide emissions, sea level rise, and the global mass extinction of species, as well as the transformation of land and water across the planet. And currently, as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet are heading towards extinction by the middle of this century. What this essentially means is a collapse of nature. We've got 1 million species threatened with extinction globally, including nearly 25% of the native bee species in North America. Insects, like bees, are essential for all ecosystems, not only as pollinators, but also as food for other animals and recyclers of nutrients. And at the current rate of decline, we could lose most insect species within a century or less. The main reason for that is loss of habitat. So essentially, when nature gets converted into something else, and it's usually something that's man-made, whether it's a large farm or a city or an urban sprawl. So looking at the climate crisis, we really have to also deal with the biodiversity crisis because it's not just about biodiversity being impacted by climate change. When we lose biodiversity, when we lose species and they go extinct, that actually makes the climate crisis worse. And that's because connected ecosystems actually help stabilize the climate, and they have a better chance at thriving in a world where the climate is changing. So rather than thinking of biodiversity as a factor or as a result of climate change, like biodiversity loss being caused by climate change, we actually have to look at biodiversity gains as a solution to the climate crisis because we can't solve one without solving the other. Now, specifically with regard to plant species, there's scientific research which points to the fact that the more diverse our landscapes are, the more native species we have planted, the more carbon they sequester. And one of the best examples of this is a 22-year study that was published in 2019. And the citation is here at the bottom. The primary author was Yang. It was published in Nature Communications. And what they found, they looked at farmland in Minnesota that was no longer being farmed. And over 22 years, they measured the carbon in the soil with different treatments of the farm. So, for example, in the first treatment, they just let the natural land revegetate, weeds and whatever came in from the land no longer being farmed. And then they had various plots. The first plot, they planted a single species of cool season grass, like a non-native grass that you would find in a lawn. And then they had a 2-species treatment, and they went up to 4, 8, and 16 species. And the 16 species treatment had a wide diversity of native flowers and grasses, including cool season sedges and warm season grasses. And what they found was that in the first 12 years of the study, there was really not much of a difference in the soil carbon across all the plots. But by the 13th year, the soil carbon storage in the plot that had the most native species was 200% higher than the site where they just let the land, vegetate naturally. So what that tells us is that it takes some time, but by about 13 years, our soil carbon storage rates can be double depending upon how diverse our planting design is. And so that directly correlates the value of planting a diversity of native plants, not only with supporting pollinators and biodiversity, but also supporting carbon sequestration. Now, looking at pollinators specifically, a study came out last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which found that over 20% of native pollinators in North America are at risk of extinction. But surprisingly, the authors of the study concluded that we don't actually know which species they are. So we have the ability to model the declines. We know that over a fifth of pollinators might go extinct, but in many parts of the United States, we don't know which species those are. Now, what's good about Massachusetts is that we have really good data. We have data going back to 1877, for example, on bee species in the state, what species they are, where they were observed. So by using that data and comparing it to contemporary observations at Landscape Interactions, we've actually been able to map out which species we should be focusing on for planting and for restoration across the state. And depending upon which part of the state you're in, it's going to be a different species list. And I'll be sharing some of that in a little bit. So why are pollinators so relevant to supporting biodiversity and supporting climate resilient landscapes? So they're primarily insects that fertilize plants producing seeds and fruit. And about 80% of the world's flowering plants need pollinators to reproduce, and that includes a lot of deciduous trees. In Massachusetts, nearly half of our food crops depend upon bees, and 1/3 of the global food supply depends upon pollinators. And most animals and ecosystems need pollinators in order to exist. Either the pollinators are necessary because, for example, with butterflies and moths, their caterpillars are feeding young birds and allowing them to become adults. In the case of bees, they're pollinating a large amount of our plants, which then produce seeds and fruit, which feeds birds and mammals and humans. And some species have a very specialized relationship. So that's known as a pollen specialist or a host plant specialist. And about 15% of our native bee species in the Northeast are pollen specialists. And what that really identifies for us is that not just any native plant is going to suffice. You have to really dial it in to the level of understanding which species you're trying to support, which species might go extinct, and then which plant species those pollinators need. So we can look through the eyes of a native bee in order to have a pretty good understanding of what a landscape would require in order to support a wide range of pollinators. Bees are a good proxy for other species. They're a good proxy for flies and hoverflies. They're also a good proxy for a lot of butterflies and moths in the sense that when those species are adults, they're going to nectar on the same plants as bees. So there's about 4,000 native bee species in the US, and over 400 of them are found in Massachusetts. And that's based on the 2021 Massachusetts bee checklist. They found over 400 species just in Massachusetts. So we have a pretty high bee species diversity, and they do the vast majority of pollination. They did a global study of 41 different food crops across every continent, and in every case, they found that wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit. Now, native bees do not fly as far as honeybees. They only fly, on average, about 200 to 1,800 feet from their nest. So habitat connectivity is really important if you're trying to support them across a wider area. 70% of native bees in Massachusetts nest underground, and most are solitary, meaning that they don't have a hive. Examples of habitat that they use includes bare ground, like dry earth in the sun, without a lot of vegetation growing on it, so like sandy soils in the sun, twigs or hollow-stemmed plants like Joe pyeweed or raspberries, abandoned rodent burrows, and dead trees and dead branches. So those are all opportunities for bee nesting. Now, with regards to honeybees and native bees, I have assembled a list of peer-reviewed articles that look at honeybee competition, and I've pulled out a few quotes from them. Essentially, the takeaway is that conserving honeybees does not help wildlife. Unfortunately, even for the most well-meaning beekeeper, when you have a hive of honeybees on a landscape, in 3 months, they're collecting enough pollen to support 100,000 native bees per hive. So that's a lot of pollen that those honeybees are collecting. And they're actually removing that pollen from the plants, pollen that could be feeding native bees. So keeping honeybees in the effort to save the bees is like raising chickens to save the birds. It doesn't really work. You have to support native pollinators differently. You can't support them by raising honeybees. In fact, you're hurting them. So in Massachusetts, there's 11 bumblebee species that have been historically found across the state. 2 of them are extirpated, meaning that they're locally extinct. They are extinct from Massachusetts. And that's a pretty high amount. That's nearly 20% of our bumblebee species. And 2 other species may be gone within the next decade if we don't do a lot to support them. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight, how to support the species that are at risk of extinction. Now, in New York State, as an example, they did a comprehensive assessment of pollinators, and they found that across New York State, 24% of native bee species were at risk of extinction in the state, so locally extinct, and 11% were extirpated, meaning that they're already locally extinct from New York. And between 38 and 60% of bees, flies, beetles, and moths were either at risk of extinction from New York or already gone. Lots of bees is not always a good thing. As an example here, this is a map of the Hudson River estuary watersheds. That's the entire land area that drains into the Hudson River between Albany, New York, and the bottom of Manhattan. In that entire area, which is quite large, it has millions of people living within it, and hundreds, if not thousands, of towns and cities. Between the year 2000 and the year 2021, 62% of all bumblebee species observed within that entire watershed were a single species, which is Bombus impatiens. So what that tells us is that we are seeing a lot of bees, but we're not seeing a lot of diversity. In fact, it's a biodiversity loss. That is best illustrated here in this bar graph. So this bar graph depicts contemporary observations in that watershed of all bumblebee species. And when I say contemporary, I mean from the year 2000 forward, compared to historical, which in the case of New York, go back to 1877. So between 1877 and 1999, there were about 18 different bumblebee species observed across the watershed. And you can see that represented with the turquoise bars in the bar graph. Between the year 2000 and the year 2021, 62% of all observations were one species. So you can see the difference in that in the middle here, it's going up. What that means is that we're seeing a lot of bees, but we're not seeing a lot of diversity. In fact, a lot of species are no longer present, and that is a biodiversity decline. That is not a good thing. We're also losing a lot of native plants. According to the Native Plant Trust, 25% of New York and New England's native plant species have been lost compared to historical figures, and non-native plant species have increased by about 20%. So in other words, we're losing native plants at nearly the same rate that we're gaining non-native and invasive plants. And UMass Amherst did research that found that invasive plant species actually spread 100 times faster than native species. Now, a lot of people may have trouble when they go to the nursery or the garden center when they're trying to buy native plants. So I'm going to explain to you the difference between a native plant and a native-var. A native plant is a plant that is bred from seeds, open pollinated, and it's a wild species. So its ancestors were wild native plants that were present on the landscape. A native-var is a cultivated version or a cultivated variety of a native plant. So it's basically horticulturally modified. It's changed by people to have a certain characteristic. In some cases, that might be showier flowers or a longer bloom time. And in other cases, what happens is that when we breed these native plants and we create these nativars, we're losing aspects of the plant that are necessary to support wildlife. So, for example, some nativars don't have pollen. Some nativars have much less nectar than their native counterparts. And so, what the scientific literature tells us is that as a whole, pollinators prefer native plants, and specifically, native plants are needed by at-risk pollinators, pollinators that might go extinct, and that's because they tend to have more specialized preferences. So I encourage you all to just purchase native plants. The way that you can tell the difference is very simple. A native plant will have a Latin name, and it will be typically two words, a genus and a species. The genus is capitalized and the species is in undercase. And they're both going to be Latin names. If there's a third word after that in single quotations in English, such as a name, then that is a nativar. So for example, you have Monarda didyma, and then you have Monarda didyma Jacob Klein. The Jacob Klein addition to the Latin name shows that it's a cultivar of that native plant. And so we don't want that one. We want to get the one that is just the simple Latin name. And a big part of that is because it's not just pollinators that depend upon native plants, it's also birds and other wildlife. Doug Tallamy did a study with Desiree Naranjo in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. in 2018. And what they found was that by surveying 160 suburban yards, the suburban yards that had less than 70% native plants were not able to support a single nest of Carolina chickadees. That's because there weren't enough caterpillars. So that is a very clear example of why native plants are important and why they're a better choice for our landscapes if we want to support pollinators and birds and wildlife, because they need them for food and they need them for habitat. So now we're going to look at a few examples of our work at Landscape Interactions and how we've addressed these issues through landscape planning and design. The first project I'm going to show you is called Healthy Soil Through Maximum Biodiversity. This is a project that is currently wrapping up, and it will be published on our website as a free PDF for download this June. The project is supported by the Healthy Soils Initiative, which was basically it's part of the EEA. So it's a state of Massachusetts agency, and they awarded us a grant to do this project. And we're working with various partner farmers across Western Massachusetts. So the vision of the project is based on our research, finding that diverse plant communities store more carbon and are part of more productive ecosystems. And there's a direct relationship between native plant diversity, soil health, and soil carbon sequestration. Why is that relevant? Because not only is a diversity of native plants going to support soils, it's also going to support more pollinators and more biodiversity. So it's a double win. So our strategy with this project has been to create a series of landscape designs that can be adopted by farmers and by homeowners across the state. They're all scalable and replicable. They're meant for any similar landscape, and we're providing all of the designs for free. So while we recognize in this project that landscape development is going to continue, unfortunately, we are going to continue to lose habitat in Massachusetts and across the planet as human populations expand and as we develop more landscapes. But if we make good decisions about how we develop our landscapes, if we're mindful about leaving parts of nature when we develop landscapes, and at the very least, adding back in nature through these designs that we've created, we can help buffer the impacts to soils and ecosystems by restoring biodiversity through plant pollinator communities, because they support the entire food web, as you can see here. So, as I mentioned, our goal in this project is to improve not only biodiversity, but also soil health. And we are doing that through our first series of designs on 7 Massachusetts farms, which includes urban community gardens. And by doing this project, we're demonstrating through collecting data on the sites before and after the designs are installed. We're collecting data on soil carbon, soil health, which includes physical, chemical, and biological attributes, and also pollinator networks. Which pollinators are on the site and which plant species are they visiting? We're collecting that baseline data. We actually did that 2 years ago. And now we're in the process of finalizing the designs and installing them. And our goal is to then go back to the sites starting after the second growing season and collect the same data. And if we're able to do that, hopefully annually, we can demonstrate how changes occur over time, not just to pollinator communities, but also to soil health and to soil carbon sequestration. So as I mentioned, they're scalable, replicable designs. They're meant for everyone, and it's free and open to the public. Here's a map of our partner farm sites. It ranges from urban community gardens and an urban park in Springfield, all the way up to one of the largest organic farms in the state, Red Fire Farm in Montague. And we've got partner farms across all 4 counties of Western Massachusetts. So as I mentioned, we're doing before and after data collection, not just on pollinator and plant communities, but also on soil health and soil carbon. And as part of this project, in order to create these designs, we wanted to, as I mentioned, support these wide parameters, soil and pollinators. So we first had to identify which pollinator species should we support. So we did a comprehensive assessment of pollinators across Western Massachusetts. We looked at native bees, butterflies, and moths, and we identified over 150 species that are at risk of local extinction or lacking data in Western Massachusetts. So those are our target species for the project. All of the different plants that those species need, whether it's to gather pollen, to lay their eggs, as in the case of Lepidoptera, or plants that they use actively for nectar gathering, those are the plants that comprise the plant lists for the designs. That makes sense. So here's a few examples of some of the species that are at risk of extinction in our part of the state and the plants they use. So the eastern willow miner bee is a pollen specialist bee. It only gathers pollen from native willow. The summer azure butterfly only lays its eggs on a small group of plants. Its host plants include New Jersey tea, dogwood, and meadowsweet, spirea. And the pink sallow moth is a somewhat specialized moth. They only lay their eggs on blueberries and cranberries, so plants in the Vaccinium genus, huckleberries, as well as oaks, and specifically black cherry. That's the only prunus species. So here's just a few shots of some of the workshops that we've held over the past 2 years. These were soil health analysis workshops that we did in partnership with NOFA, Massachusetts, the Northeast Organic Farming Alliance, and planting that we did with the farmers directly. And then, our site preparation varies for the different sites. On some sites, to prepare them before we planted, we tarped them for 5 months. On other sites, we did tillage followed by cover cropping. On other sites, we had different strategies. So that's all part of the final deliverables of this project, how we got to where we got. And let's look at some of the data that we've been collecting on the sites. This is all baseline data that was collected before the designs were installed. So this is 2 different diagrams looking at plant pollinator communities on 2 very different sites. On the left, we have Red Fire Farm in Montague. It's a rural crop field. It's surrounded by Mass Wildlife protected space. So it had a pretty high pollinator diversity. We were able to observe 21 different pollinator species on the site, including 2 of our target species, so the species that were already on our list to support. We found 82 individual pollinators, and this is all on surveys that were conducted across the 2024 growing season. And we found 68 different interactions between pollinators and native plants. Whereas at Liberty Hill Townhouses in Springfield, an urban park surrounded by impervious surfaces and developed landscapes with very little native vegetation, across the entire season, we only found 3 species of pollinators and only 7 individuals with 0 visitations to native plants. So that's a comparison between 2 very different sites. what that really tells us is that our urban landscapes, not only are they low in abundance of pollinators, they're also low in diversity. And so they really merit our attention in the sense that we want to enable more pollinators to visit those sites and make those sites more biodiverse and more resilient to climate change. Whereas in many of our rural areas, they might already have a decent amount of species diversity. However, if we compare pollinator species observations to soil carbon measurements, it's actually very different. So the gray circles on this map represent percentage of soil organic carbon that was found on the various sites. So the bigger the circle, the more carbon the soil had. And the yellow circles represent pollinator species. The bigger the yellow circle, the more pollinator species were observed. So you can see here, there's actually no direct correlation between carbon and pollinators. In fact, some of our sites in Springfield that had the highest amount of soil carbon had the lowest amount of pollinator diversity. What that basically tells us is that there might only be one factor involved with pollinator diversity. I'm sorry, there might be only one factor to sort of get, to address to have high carbon in your soils. And that's basically landscape management. How you manage your landscape and essentially whether or not you disturb it, whether or not you disturb the soils through tillage, through scraping, through digging, through removal, that directly correlates with carbon. So the less disturbance to the soil, the higher the carbon you're going to have. And that's really regardless of whether you have grass growing or whether you have a meadow. But if you did have a meadow and you compared it to grass and the meadow had been on the site for as long as the grass, the meadow would hold more carbon. And that's because the meadow species have deeper roots and they're more diverse. In the case of these sites, Red Fire Farm, it was a site in the middle of a crop field. So it had been disturbed. It had been tilled within probably 3 or 4 years of when we measured it. Whereas in Springfield, we were measuring carbon on these sites that were sort of just grass that might have had a community garden on top of it or had a public park, inside of it. So they weren't tilling the soil. So to address pollinator diversity, you really need to look at multiple factors. It's landscape management in combination with the context, the surrounding location, what's growing there, what's existing there. So that's really where biodiversity comes into play. It's sort of a more complex issue. Here's just a few images of some of our soil testing. We did a pretty comprehensive analysis with Ruben Parilla from Nova, Mass. So we measured physical, chemical, and biological attributes. And then we scored each of our 10 sites according to those factors. What was interesting with this was that some of the sites that scored the highest in terms of soil health were sites that did not score well for pollinator health. So it was sort of, two separate issues. But overall, landscape management is the primary consideration with soil health. The way you manage your landscape is directly going to relate. And that's where we have a lot of control. So now we're going to look at some of our designs. So I was speaking to you about Liberty Hill Townhouses, the urban park in Springfield. They had very, very high soil carbon, very, very low pollinator diversity. So I'm going to show you now some pictures of the site. As you can see here, it's sort of like a small public park covered with grass. There's a basketball court, there's some paved surfaces, and a path. We did various landscape analyses for the site before we created our design. This is pretty typical of our process. We look at things like soils, how much sun it gets across the growing season, topography, drainage, existing land use, and then we identified this area here in purple for our design. It was the area that got the most sun, the area that was not currently vegetated with anything but grass, and it was in a visible location. Our request for this site from the landowner was to create small ornamental designs that could be easily maintained. And so we decided to create 3 small meadows that could be planted inside portable containers. So sort of like the kind of container that you might see outside a restaurant that has outdoor seating, where they set up these planters, to kind of like create a space in a parking lot or on a patio. It's the kind of container that anyone can build, that you can purchase from Home Depot, you can purchase from your garden center. Basically, it's 2 feet by 4 feet, and it's 2 feet high. And so this is our design for the site. We created these three unique meadows that could each be fit into a 2 by 4 container with 2 feet of soil to grow in. When the roots of those plants get deep enough that they need to reach beyond the 2 feet, they'll start to penetrate directly into the grass that's below them. And that's because the bottom of the container is open. And this is a wonderful opportunity for people that live in small urban areas or people that are renting that are not sure if they need to move their garden in 1 or 2 years. This is an opportunity to create native habitat, to create support pollinators on a small landscape. Our second site, looking at Red Fire Farm in Montague, as I mentioned, it was a crop field that had been previously under production for vegetables, but the farmer had abandoned it because it wasn't very productive. So it's about a 60-foot a 60-foot wide by 240-foot long crop field section. So that's about a third of an acre, and surrounded by other crops and forest. So to prepare this site for planting, because it was at a rather large scale, the farmer used a very shallow implement on the tractor, just enough to disturb the soil, about 3 inches. So it was like a shallow tillage followed by a smoothing. And then we planted buckwheat. And we allowed the buckwheat to grow for the entire spring and summer. Usually midsummer, buckwheat goes to seed and then it reseeds itself again. So you get a second rotation or a second generation for free. And then in the fall, in September, the farmer also added field oats, which are just common oats, like what you would find in oatmeal. Oats were added in September to accompany the buckwheat as the buckwheat sort of died out as it got colder. And what we did was we seeded a meadow directly into the cover crop in late October. And so this is an image of what the site will look like in a few years. Essentially, it's a short meadow on the ground. And then above it, there's widely spaced chestnut trees, plum, and serviceberry, as well as hazelnut. All of those are native species with the exception of the chestnut, which is a hybrid. And that's because of the chestnut blight. So here's our layout for the site. It's about 14 widely spaced chestnuts over a third of an acre, with in between pairs of plums, pairs of hazelnuts, and pairs of serviceberries. And then we have our seed mix for the meadow. This is all species that are highly drought tolerant and none of which grow above 4 feet. So things like pussy toes, dogbane, columbine, butterfly weed, yellow wild indigo, New Jersey tea, fireweed, lupin, little blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, purple top, a couple of goldenrods and asters, some beard tongue, some bee balm, and some bush clover. With all of these projects, as I mentioned, we're going to be publishing this on our website at the end of June. So you can go to landscapeinteractions.com and sign up for our email list if you want to make sure you're getting notified when this is released. They're all going to have a management timeline, management plan, and a maintenance schedule that can be followed. I just want to call out here the importance of creating habitat for bees. We have designed this bee nesting strip detail specifically for people that want to support ground nesting bees. Ground nesting bees are about 70% of our native bee species. So to do that, it's very simple. You find an area with dry soils, so soils that are not, usually with ponding or with standing water, preferably sandy soils or like a sandy loam, and that they're in the full sun, they're not shaded. And what you do is you just simply remove the top 4 inches of soil and vegetation, and then you can save half of that topsoil in a bucket and mix it with sand and then put it back. So what you've now created is even sandier soil. You put back 50% loam, 50% sand, down to 4 inches. And you just basically have to keep that clear of any weeds or vegetation. Just allow it to be a space on the landscape with nothing growing. And what I like to do is I like to take some 2x4s and basically create like a frame on the ground, it could be 2 by 4 feet, it could be 4 by 8 feet, and you just create that frame with the wood and you set it in the ground in that hole you've just dug, and then you put the soil and the sand mixed inside of it. So what that does is it shows you where to keep where to keep it free of vegetation, sort of marks it on the landscape. The next site was a farm in Hampshire County. They raise livestock and they also have some vegetable production. So for them, we created a section of a field that would be turned into a native grazing area. So it's basically like a meadow that's suitable for grazing, as well as a riparian buffer. So this is our riparian buffer design. It was planted last fall, and it has a lot of benefits. Not only is it supporting a wide range of different pollinators, some of which are represented here with plants like pussy willow, red maple, Lyonia, cranberry, pickerel weed, but also it's providing shade for the livestock because this riparian buffer is oriented on the portion of the field that was basically in the sun and was not, the livestock did not have access to shade. So with this design, they can rest on the northern side of the buffer. And it's also preventing the livestock from visiting the pond for water, which then, improves water quality and minimizes erosion. For the section of the farm where we did the grazing mix, I've listed the list of species here. These are all species that are well adapted for grazing. They're also native and they also support pollinators. Looking at an urban site, we have a farm in Holyoke. It's called Nuestras Raíces. And for this site, we had a couple of different locations. The one I'm showing you now is a windbreak. It was basically to be inserted along the edge of a field to stop the wind from blowing across the annual vegetable crops and preventing erosion. So it's a mix of trees and shrubs as well as herbaceous vegetation. For trees, we use things like hackberry, eastern redbud, eastern red cedar, beech plum, American plum, chokecherry, scrub oak, dwarf chestnut oak, sumac, serviceberry. And then we had our herbaceous layer. We've got our bee nesting strips here on the southern side that I showed you earlier, all incorporated. Again, a benefit to that is, providing shade in the summer for perhaps some of the leafy greens, like things like lettuce and spinach that might be difficult to grow in the summer. Well, you can grow them in the shade of the windbreak. Indian Line Farm in Egremont is in the Berkshires. For this farm, we created a series of native shrubs that are basically wetland shrubs or wetland edge. This section of the farm is too wet for them to actively grow vegetables in. It's also part of a riparian buffer area, so they didn't want to till it. So what we did was we planted into a row cover, which could then just be weeded occasionally. So these are all native shrubs that have a productive value in the sense that they can be sold as cuttings as part of floral arrangements. So things like willow and dogwood and elderberry, things that produce berries, things that produce flowers that are either ornamental or medicinal or both. We also created a design for them to fill in a section of their fence line that had been where the trees had died. They were ash trees that had died because of the emerald ash borer. And so we created like an all native fence line design for them with things like serviceberry, gray birch, hawthorn, poplar, chokecherry, oak, and so on. And then here's just a few images of some of the workshops. This was us installing the meadow with volunteers at Red Fire Farm. It was all broadcast by hand after the cover crop rotation. This is the installation of the riparian buffer at Stonebridge Farm and the grazing pasture at Stonebridge Farm for livestock. Habit to Habitat is not only the name of tonight's presentation, it's also a site that you can all visit in Wellesley, Massachusetts. So it's located next to the large public library in Wellesley on Washington Street, which is called Simmons Park. So we've converted this entire site into a very diverse public park or public garden. So when we began the project, the site looked like this. It was all mowed grass. It was pretty monotonous. And in fact, we surveyed the site 3 times to see which pollinators we would find on it. The site was surveyed by Dr. Robert Jagier, who is out of UMass Dartmouth in the southeastern part of the state. He's an entomologist and a specialist in bumblebee plant communities. And he surveyed the site twice in August of 2022, as well as in May of 2023. On every single visit, he could not find a single bee or butterfly anywhere on the site. So we basically were building from scratch. There was no diversity on the site of pollinators. We worked with Dr. Jagier as well as Michael Veet and Molly Jacobson to develop a list of species to target for this project. So essentially, which bees and butterflies might be at risk of local extinction in northeastern or Middlesex County. And we found this list of species, 45 native bee species and 31 butterfly species, all at risk. So these are our target species for the project. The plants that support these species are the plants that are in the design. Here's what the design will hopefully look like in a few years. We're going into our third growing season this spring. So it's a very diverse site. It's got a mix of meadows, woodland edge plantings. It's got some open spaces, a mowed path in the middle. There's some gathering areas with large granite benches. And we've got a few widely spaced trees, all of which support a variety of different pollinator species. This is a diagram of the various bloom times of the species that are planted on the site. So you can see that we're filling all of the gaps from March through October. Throughout the growing season, there's various things blooming, various things producing pollen and nectar, various plants providing opportunities for Lepidoptera to lay their eggs. That is what is required to support a wide diversity of species. You need to have constant bloom times throughout the season. So what that means is you're going to have a mix of trees and shrubs, and you're going to have a mix of grasses and flowers. You can't just have flowers to support pollinators. Some butterflies and moths only lay their eggs on grasses or sedges, or conversely, some bees only visit shrubs for pollen. So we really need to look at the wide plant community. And by doing that, again, you're going to be supporting better soils, higher soil carbon. So it's a win for everything. How did we get this site to become what it is today? Well, we had to remove all of the grass. So we opted to do large-scale tarping using reusable black plastic. This is 6 millimeters thick black silage tarps that you can order from Johnny's Seeds. You can get them in 5,000 square foot rolls. And so we ordered a few rolls. We cut them to fit the perimeter of the design. We sandbagged them, and we left them down for the entire growing season, May through September. In order to get public buy-in for the project, this is right next to the library. This site is highly visible. We partnered with the Wellesley Natural Resources Commission to create stencils of different pollinators and plants that were then drawn on large pieces of cardboard and cut out, and we spray painted them onto the plastic. So here's some before and after pictures of what the site looked like. You can see here, we were tarping in 2023, we were seeding our meadow in 2023, and by 2025, it was fully established, fully grown in, very, very lush. This picture on the left is that first picture I showed you at the beginning, showing the large area of grass. This is the same area taken 3 years later when it's fully grown in. So transformation can occur in a pretty short timeline if you do the right site preparation, if you choose the right plants for the right site. And in the case of this site, I'm proud to say that this site was only watered once. We planted it in September 2023. We got a decent amount of rain. I think there was a mild drought that fall. They watered once. They put some watering bags on the trees, and I don't think it was watered at all in 2024 or 2025. I believe that we just kept the watering bags on for 2 years. So looking at bumblebee and butterfly observations, actually all bee and butterfly observations, as I mentioned, when we started the project, there were 0 observations in 2022 and 2023. And then the site was installed in September of 2023. We began follow-up surveys last year. We want to give it at least one full season to grow in. So we started our follow-up observations up at the very beginning of the second growing season after installation, which is like pretty quickly. And by the end of last summer, we were already observing not only a wide variety of species, but including some of our target species, our species at risk of extinction. So here's the full list of bees and butterflies that were observed at the site in 2025. 3 of those bee species are species at risk, so they were targets for the project. And one of them was a county record, meaning that it had never been observed ever in the history of observations recorded in Norfolk County. So that's a pretty amazing opportunity here. We actually got a new bee observation for Wellesley and for this county. This is a diagram of the various interactions between bees and butterflies and plants on the site. So there were 351 different observations of bees and butterflies visiting plants between May and September last year. 91% of those observations were with native plant species. Over 38% were with goldenrod, and nearly 30% were with native thistle. Now, native thistle is an interesting plant. A lot of people don't like to use it in pollinator garden designs or in habitat designs because it's 9 feet tall, it's biennial, and it has very, very sharp thorns. So you can see here, this is what thistle looks like when I'm standing next to it, and I'm about 6 feet tall. So less than 10% of our interactions were with non-native species. And thistle's important because thistle supports a lot of species, and especially bees love to visit it for nectar. We have an iNaturalist project for the site. Basically, what that means is there's a shapefile uploaded to iNaturalist that is the perimeter of our design area. So it only includes the physical space where the plants were installed, where we transformed the park. And the data that we're getting there is pretty incredible. So any observation on iNaturalist that's ever uploaded that is taken on that physical space will be added to our project automatically. Now, as of last fall, I haven't updated this since about November, but as of November, we've gotten 216 observations on iNaturalist, representing 114 different species of plants and animals. Before our project began, so back, in 2022 and just in 2022 or before, there were only 62 observations on iNaturalist representing 33 species, and over a third of those observations were of either invasive or non-native species. Since the project was installed, so looking at observations after September 2023, there's been 154 observations representing 97 species, and over 83% of them are native. Before the project was installed, there were only 3 insect species observed on the site. Since the project was installed, there's been 39 species of insects observed on the site. So that's a 1,200% increase in insect species diversity since the design was installed, including our 3 at-risk bee species, one of which is a county record. So I encourage you all to, if you don't already know how to use it, to download iNaturalist on your smartphone and to get out there and start observing things. And please, if you go to Wellesley, go to our site and take pictures of plants, take pictures of insects, take pictures of birds, anything that you see, and upload it to iNaturalist. Lastly, I'll look at a project that we did in Egremont in the Berkshires. This is one of our older sites. It was installed in 2020. So again, it was a public park. It was all mowed grass, and we installed the entire project with volunteers, same as what we did in Wellesley. In both of those locations, it was basically a little bit of heavy lifting done with the DPW, things like moving boulders around or helping, deliver large tarps and roll them out. And then everything else was hand planted with volunteers, working with small tools. So here's a few before and after pictures of the site. In Egremont, this site has been around for about 6 years, so it's pretty well established. You can see some of these before and after pictures, basically going from grass to wide diversity of shrubs, trees, flowers, grasses, sedges, everything. And as far as bumblebees go, we're specifically tracking bumblebees on this site. Back in 2020, before we disturbed the site, before we removed the grass, before we did anything, we observed bumblebees, and we found two bumblebee species on the site, and they're both common species. Since the design has been installed, we've surveyed the site with a group of citizen scientists in 2023, and then more officially last year with a trained entomologist. And we've observed one, two, three, 8 different bumblebee species on the site, 3 of which are our target species, so species at risk of extinction. So that's a 350% increase in bumblebee species diversity on the same location over a 5-year period. Here's a few images of our citizen science workshop that was taught by Dr. Robert Jagier from UMass Dartmouth. And this was really great. In 1 hour, in the middle of July in 2023, we observed 7 different bumblebee species on our site. So again, before and after, before the design was installed, 2 species observed, both common species. And then since the design's been installed, we've surveyed it again 2 more years, and we've observed up to 8 species, and 3 of them are our targets. So essentially, our process at Landscape Interactions is pretty simple. We set goals at the beginning, and almost always our goal is to improve the functional diversity of the landscape over time. What that really means is finding more species on the site, attracting more species to the site, and more of a diversity of species that fill a more diverse range of roles within the ecosystem. So not just one type of bee, not just one type of butterfly, the wide range of species that will represent true biodiversity and true ecological resilience. We typically use bees and butterflies as a sort of, guidepost, or that's what we are surveying for. We just simply don't have the time or resources to survey for all insects or all wildlife. But bee and butterfly diversity is a very good proxy for the wider food web. We're also increasingly looking at soil health and soil organic carbon as a metric to measure before and after. And usually it takes at least 3 years to have that complete study, where you've got the baseline surveys done before the designs, and then you're doing usually at least 2 years of follow-up data collection, starting with the second or third growing season. So science informs the design process. It informs the plants that we select for the designs based on which pollinators use them or which species need them, and it's how we measure our results. And all of our projects have a maintenance plan and a management regime. So I encourage you to go to our website. I've got it right here, landscapeinteractions.com. You can sign up for our email list. You can email me if you have a project you want to talk about. You can also go to our website and book a consultation if you want me to come visit your property or come visit your project and help you directly out in the field. So it's been really great talking to you tonight. I'm going to wrap it up and take your questions. Thanks so much.
Okay, I'm not totally trusting my voice. So could you read the questions out of the chat?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Let's just go to the top here. And how are we doing? Okay, we're doing great with time. That was just about an hour. Okay, so should we take, let's say, like about 15, 20 minutes for questions and answers? Would that be
Yeah,
about?
that's
Okay.
great.
Okay, so I actually, okay, so the first question, well, I have Russ Cohen, who's a friend and a colleague and someone whose opinion and experience I respect very much. He's giving some links to ACE's Yard RX program. I don't, okay, that's not really a question, but should we be boycotting ACE hardware? The question is, should we be boycotting ACE hardware? I would have to go to that link to really answer that, but I would say if they're not recommending native plants, I don't know if we should necessarily boycott them, but perhaps not buy plants from them would be a good start. We could take a look at what they're actually doing here. Your prescription for a beautiful yard. Okay, so this is a lot about lawn stuff. I don't think that necessarily, I don't know if I would say boycotting them. I mean, in my case, I have only like 2 hardware stores I can go to within less than 30 minutes, and one of them is Ace. So perhaps Abramson's a better choice. I don't know. The next question is, where can I access your designs? Well, we don't offer all of our designs, to the public, but as I mentioned, our Healthy Soils project is forthcoming as a free open source project. So it's not done yet. So you can go to landscapeinteractions.com and you can sign up for our email list, and then you'll be on the list for when it comes out. And I'll show you guys, it's very simple because this may not be straightforward. So you're going to get to our website. It's going to look like this. Obviously, you can go here if you want to book a consult. Otherwise, you just enter the site, you click this, and then you go to the bottom and you sign up for our email list here. That's the best way to stay abreast of what we're offering. If you specifically have a question about a site, you can go to the consult link. Going back to the questions, do you fertilize the soil prior to planting natives? No. In fact, most native plant species in Massachusetts are adapted to growing in the native conditions of the soil, which tend to be pretty poor. So for example, if you're doing like a meadow, or if you're doing a sort of a typical, native garden, I do not recommend fertilizing it. I recommend just removing the existing vegetation and planting directly into it, and then mulching it with wood chips or similar natural materials like leaf mulch. Now, the exception to that is a lot of our wetland plants and wetland edge plants do like richer soils, but naturally they're getting that when you plant them in their appropriate conditions. So wetlands tend to be more rich because they're usually the point in the landscape where the water is draining and settling. So naturally, they're going to get a lot of the runoff off of the other areas of the site. So they tend to accumulate more nutrients. So if you plant the right plant for the right location, if you only use wetland plants in wetland locations, you don't even need to fertilize those because, again, those locations already have higher nutrient soils. When you add compost or add fertilizer to the soil, what you're going to do is you're going to promote a lot of weed growth. You're going to promote a lot of non-native species like non-native grasses, like turf grasses, and even invasives. Russ Cohen said, Wellesley is in Norfolk County, not Middlesex. That's correct. And I did mention that our bee observation for Wellesley, it was a Norfolk County record. And I apologize if I said Middlesex earlier in the presentation. My husband and I want to reduce the size of our small yard. We only have about 1/6 of an acre, and replace it with native plants. How can we get rid of the grass without laying down black plastic? I would say, since you have a really small site, 1/6 of an acre, I would go to your local equipment rental place, which could be a tool rental, like Taylor Rental, or even Home Depot or Lowe's rent tools, and rent a tool called a sod cutter. A sod cutter is basically a gas-powered small machine that you push like a snowblower, and it will rip out the grass and roll it up. And then you just can compost that or place it somewhere else. And you can plant directly into the ground after you remove the soil. Now, I'm not going to promise that you're not going to get weeds or even grasses growing back after that. So please plant and mulch very, very thickly with wood chips to try to suppress that. I would recommend at least 4 inches of wood chips, if not even more, like 6, because even when you use the sod cutter, there's always still some roots that remain for the existing grass. If you really want to be the most comprehensive and you have a bit of time, what you could do is you could use the sod cutter now in the spring for the area that you want to plant. And then just simply put 6 inches of wood chips on it and wait. And spend the rest of the summer just watching things grow through the wood chips and pulling them out. And just keep adding wood chips if they break down. And then in the fall, plant into the wood chips. Just make small little holes where you need to put your plants and then cover them back up with the wood chips at the base of the plant. That is a very, very successful process for minimizing weed growth and not using black plastic on a small site. Yeah, you can also do cardboard mulching, as Russ recommended in the chat. It's really just a matter of preference. Okay, looks like we don't have any questions except the very last one. Would you identify the native grasses that are especially important for pollinators? Okay, that's a great question. So it really depends on which pollinators you're talking about, but largely speaking, there's a couple of grasses that really stand out, especially because they support a lot of the skipper butterflies and a lot of the butterflies that are the highest risk of extinction in Massachusetts. So the grasses that we tend to use the most are little blue stem, big blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, and river oats, um, as well as purple top. We also use a lot of sedges. A lot of sedges are host plants. So for wetland edges, you can use things like Carex stricta or Carex lacustris. There's really so many different sedges. For drier areas, you can use Carex pennsylvanica, Carex appalachiana. You can use pretty much any native sedge. Uh, Depends on if it's dry or moist, if it's sunny or shady. What's good about specifically big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass is that they also are very palatable to livestock. So for those of you that have goats or sheep or cows, you can put them out to graze on those grasses with a mix of flowers. Um, any suggestions for getting rid of orange bittersweet, which I'm assuming you're referring to oriental bittersweet? No, honestly, I don't really have a go-to for that other than cutting it and painting it with herbicides or spot spraying it with herbicides. I personally have found that no matter how much you pull bittersweet or mow it or even dig it out, it grows back. And so we have unfortunately resorted to using very, very specific herbicide treatments on that. Um, any problems planting New Jersey tea plants in the landscape? I understand deer and rabbits are very fond of nibbling on them. To be quite honest, deer and rabbits are very fond of nibbling on the wide variety of native plants. And that's why we don't see a lot of them growing in our woods anymore. And that's why we don't see them out on the landscape. So even butterfly weed, I've seen deer just bite the heads right off of that in the middle of a huge meadow where there's plenty of other things for them to eat. I've seen deer go nuts on, and rabbits, well, deer, not deer, but rabbits on low bush blueberry. I've seen deer destroy northern bush honeysuckle and, just so many plants. So unfortunately, I'm not of the mindset of don't plant things that deer eat, because if we did that, we'd be working with such a reduced list of plants that the biodiversity gains might be really minimal. We have to really work proactively to prevent deer from eating our native plants by protecting those plants when they're in their early stages of growth, or by doing more hunting in the location where the planting is occurring. And I think a combined strategy usually works the best. So we typically are caging all of our shrubs and trees when we plant them and just leaving those cages on them basically until the plant is well above the height of the cage. And for caging, I use 4-foot wide hardware cloth with a wooden stake. And I just create like a cylinder and put the plant inside of it. For herbaceous species, my strategy is oftentimes just plant a lot and hopefully they just won't get to everything. So like with our Wellesley site as a good example, or our Egremont site, those are both public parks. There's really zero fencing. There's zero fencing, completely none. And there's very minimal caging. Like I think in Wellesley, we just caged like a scrub oak and like the low bush blueberry. And it's doing fine. I mean, there's plenty of flowers, there's plenty of shrubs, and the deer are there and the rabbits are there. So I just feel like we need to, you know, do a lot and, maybe be mindful about caging certain things. Um, let's see here. Where again is the Wellesley site? The Wellesley site is located next to the library on Washington Street. So if you just go to Google Maps and you put in the Wellesley Free Library, main branch, Wellesley Free Library, main branch, 530 Washington Street, Wellesley, and it's the park that's directly next to it. Is there a list of what you designed for the grazing area? Yes, I can show that again. And again, just sign up on our website for the email list. And I will definitely make sure that everyone gets the notification when we publish that project so that you can also download it. So going back to the grazing mix, I'll just leave this on screen for a couple of minutes so you can look at it. This was for a site that the soils were like not extremely dry. They were more like medium to slightly moist. So I sort of shifted my typical grazing mix for those conditions. So this works well for that. It was like, more like average soils. We can call them mesic. But I also have a version of the grazing mix that I've done for Martha's Vineyard, which is extremely drought tolerant, which I would be happy to also share. So what I'll do here is I'm going to leave this up for like another minute, and then I will close this slide, and I'll show you another one that is for a drier site. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good amount of time. So here's this. And again, you can sign up on our website for our email list, and you can definitely get this, in a more permanent manner. Let's just look here for this. So this project here, which hopefully you can see, let me just make sure you can see this 1 second. It's called Farming for Biodiversity. If you Google this, you can probably download it off of the Island Grown Initiative website. They were our partners. So if you put into Google Farming for Biodiversity Landscape Interactions or Farming for Biodiversity Island Grown Initiative, you will definitely get this. And it's a really cool project. It is a series of replicable farm designs specifically for Martha's Vineyard, which I think is widely applicable to the Cape as well, and perhaps southeastern Massachusetts as a whole, like at least the coastal areas of Southeast, because it's suitable for the same pollinator communities. So it features field borders, hedgerows, and different grazing mixes, and all replicable, all scalable. And I've got right here our grazing area seed mix right here. So this is all drought tolerant species, things like yarrow. Well, big bluestem is arguably kind of a little bit of both, but it can do well. Partridge pea, Danthonia spicata, which is another one of those native grasses that's good for host plants for Lepidoptera. Showy tick trefoil, purple lovegrass, and on and on and on. So you'll see some repetitions between this and the other mix. Again, like, a lot of these plants are suitable for more than one type of location. They're not just only for one type of soil. But here, that's just something else to consider. And lastly, let's see if we have any more questions. Okay, I'm gonna close with this question from Russ. I have a dozen high bush blueberry nativar bushes of various types on my 4,500 square foot lot. I would like to think that they offer some food to at-risk species of wild bumblebees. Am I deluding myself? I don't know. Only one way to find out, which would be you could at least use bumblebees. Yeah, you're suggesting bumblebees. So then I would say, Russ, you're fully capable to do this. Go out to the blueberries when they're in flower, which is probably, I'm guessing, in May, and photograph the hell out of them between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. on sunny days, and just upload everything to iNaturalist if you don't know how to identify it. Take pictures of every single bee you see on them, or you could just do bumblebees. I would just do everything. Identify it to the family or genus level if you can, or if not, just leave it. And people will identify them for you, especially the bumblebees. there's a very, very active community of entomologists on iNaturalist that are just basically going around correcting everyone's misidentifications of bees and other species. So you're in good hands on iNaturalist, and you'll find out. You'll know by the end of the summer. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and just thanks so much. And any last comments, Lori? Are you still sort of
Yeah.
unable to speak?
Thank you so much, Evan. That was really great, as you can see by all the hands clapping and the hearts. I would just like to thank everybody for coming and encourage everyone to come to our live expo tomorrow at Kennedy's Country Gardens in Scituate. And that's from 10 to 2. And we do have a shuttle tomorrow going from Oro, so you can park and take the shuttle. So again, thank you so much, Evan.
It was great to be here. And yeah, have fun tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye
Bye.
bye.